Hey guys, Justin here. Today I'm going to convince you that quilts are better than sleeping bags when backpacking or camping. I'm going to go over the benefits of quilts, and there's a lot of them, and then I'm going to address some of the worries that I hear from a lot of people out there about why they're a little bit hesitant to use quilts. And I just want to say that I'm not coming at this from the perspective of a hardcore ultralight thru hiker. I'm a weekend warrior. I like to be lightweight when I'm backpacking, but overall I like to be comfortable, and that's where I think quilts really shine. So one of the first things you'll hear about quilts versus sleeping bags is that quilts just are made with less material. So while a sleeping bag wraps all the way around you, a quilt is open on the bottom. So you sleep directly on the sleeping pad, and then the quilt just wraps around three sides of you. And what this allows is for quilts to be much lighter than sleeping bags. An REI Magma 15 sleeping bag, which has a comfort rating of 30 degrees Fahrenheit, weighs 28 ounces, where the equivalent temperature rating for an Enlightened Equipment Enigma quilt weighs 18 ounces. So that's a lot of weight savings for the quilt versus the sleeping bag. This next benefit for quilts might surprise you, and that's cost. Quilts cost quite a bit less than sleeping bags of equivalent temperature rating. So let's go back to that REI Magma sleeping bag that we were comparing to the Enlightened Equipment quilt. The REI sleeping bag costs $380, whereas the Enlightened Equipment Enigma quilt costs $300. So the quilt is lighter and costs less than an equivalent sleeping bag. And the REI Magma is considered a really good value sleeping bag that has good specs for a good price. Another big benefit of quilts is customization. Quilts are predominantly made by cottage manufacturers at this point, and because of that, you can customize a lot of features on a quilt. You can get a custom length, custom width, custom colors, custom fabric types, as well as choose the power fill of your down, how much down you're putting in your quilt, as well as a ton of other features. I'm going to be putting together a video on how to order a custom quilt online, and in that video I'm going to be going over all the different features that you can customize, as well as what those customizations might mean for usability for you on the trail. So subscribe to the channel and click that bell button if you want to be notified when that video drops. Like I alluded to at the beginning of the video, the number one reason I like quilts is for the comfort. It allows me to sleep like I sleep at home. I'm not sleeping at home in a sleeping bag. I have a blanket over top of me, and what that allows me to do is sleep naturally and toss and turn and move as needed without getting tangled up like I do with a sleeping bag. And they're especially good for active sleepers. I move from one side to the other side, my back to my stomach, and as I'm tossing and turning, I'm not getting tangled up and waking up randomly in the middle of the night. I haven't met one active sleeper yet who doesn't prefer a quilt over a sleeping bag once they try a quilt out. The last major benefit for quilts is versatility. I find you can use quilts in a much broader range of temperatures, especially using a colder rated quilt for warmer temperatures, because you can adjust easier in the middle of the night. You can stick an arm out if you start getting too warm, stick a leg out much easier if you start getting too warm, or just generally loosen the quilt off and move it off of you a little bit. Compared to a sleeping bag where the only thing you can do is really unzip, and you can't really get your legs cooled off as easy compared to a quilt. And because of that versatility, I find myself sweating less when using a quilt. I'm able to manage my temperature better. And one of the things that really cools me off when I'm camping is sweating. If I start sweating in my insulation, then I'm gonna be much cooler than if I'm able to regulate my temperature and avoid getting sweaty. So those are the major benefits of using a quilt. I think they're all really good benefits, especially that comfort aspect. Now I want to address the four big reasons I hear from people of why they're hesitant to use a quilt. And only one of these actually holds any weight in my books. First up is the fact that there's no bottom to the quilt like there is a sleeping bag, and people are afraid that they're going to get cold. And this gets at a bigger problem in that a lot of people don't understand how important a sleeping pad is for staying warm when camping. A sleeping pad is really going to be your main piece of insulation that keeps you warm from really cold ground. And the ground's a lot colder than you think. If you have an appropriately rated sleeping pad, like I do with this quilt right now, I have a Thermarest X-Therm, which has a R value of 6.7, which is very warm and good for winter camping. You're going to be warm regardless of whether you have that bottom on the quilt or not. Something that happens with sleeping bags that people don't really understand is that when you're laying on them, you're compressing that insulation, especially if it's down, and you're losing a lot of your insulative properties because that insulation is compressed. So you don't actually lose a lot of warmth value using a quilt compared to a sleeping bag, even though you don't have that bottom side. And another thing that makes people a little bit hesitant to use quilts, and this is a little bit related to that last point, is that people just think quilts are generally colder than sleeping bags. But this is not the case. Quilt manufacturers test their quilts and they'll tell you what the comfort rating is for a quilt, just like a sleeping bag manufacturer will. And in my experience, especially with the major quilt manufacturers, their temperature ratings are very accurate. I went on a trip last weekend where temperatures got to below 0 degrees Fahrenheit.
Justin says it got down to -20 last night on his little
-19.1.
And I used a quilt system and was very warm. You just need to make sure that you're using the quilts properly. And in that video, I go over 5 things that are important when using a quilt in order to stay warm, like reducing drafts, keeping your head warm, things like that. So go check out that video. I'll post a link in the video description and you can see what those tips are and get a bit of an idea of what you need to do in order to stay warm when temperatures do get down to sub-zero and really quite cold. Another worry I hear from people is that they think they're going to be uncomfortable because they're sleeping directly on the sleeping pad instead of having a sleeping bag in between them and the sleeping pad. And this is something that I've never really experienced because I wear base layers all the time when I'm sleeping. If you sleep naked, then maybe this is a problem and you may get a little bit clammy and sticky when sleeping directly on the pad. But a way to address that would be to get a pad cover. And the combination of a pad cover and a quilt is still going to be lighter than a sleeping bag overall. So if you are worried about sleeping directly on the pad, maybe just consider that pad cover. And this last worry, and the only one that really kind of holds some weight, is that people think quilts can be a little bit finicky. And I'm not going to argue with you. There's a few more steps involved when setting up your quilt, when you're attaching pad straps, cinching up the neck, and things like that. But really it adds maybe 10 or 30 seconds to your camp setup. And to me, the benefits of having a much lighter sleep system and also being more comfortable when I'm sleeping really outweigh the finicky aspect. So far, I've met 2 people who have used a quilt and still prefer a sleeping bag. And there's a few reasons why that is, and you may fall into one of these categories. First up is that you actually like being cocooned and kind of constricted when you're sleeping. One of these people that I know who still likes a sleeping bag more than a quilt just really likes being all wrapped up and find it really cozy being in a sleeping bag. They're not a very active sleeper. They're not tossing and turning. They just fall asleep and they're a log. And for them, a sleeping bag works, and that's fine. Another scenario where a sleeping bag makes more sense than a quilt is if you're in very, very, very cold temperatures and any little bit of draft is gonna cause you to freeze. A quilt will still have a little bit of drafts no matter what you do. And if you're in those temperatures where you're getting down to -30, -40, a sleeping bag is probably just gonna be a better call because you're gonna have less risk of getting cold in the middle of the night. And when you're at those temperatures, you wanna reduce risk as much as possible. So should you go out and buy a quilt right now? If you're looking for a new piece of 3-season insulation for sleeping, then I would strongly consider getting a quilt over a sleeping bag. Some of you out there are also really looking to drop your pack weight. Maybe you're getting older and you want to have less weight on your back, or you're trying to crush a lot of miles. A quilt's going to be lighter, like I said, so definitely consider a quilt if you're trying to drop weight. It's one of the big 4 items and is going to have one of the most significant impacts on weight in your pack relative to something like a spoon. If you have any questions about quilts, let me know in the comment section below. If you want me to expand on any points down there, ask away and I'll happily get into a really detailed gearhead discussion with you. That's what I really like about the comment section. Maybe I didn't convince you that quilts are better than sleeping bags, but hopefully I gave you a little bit of food for thought. Thanks for watching, guys, and we'll see you next time.